introduce Liana and Melissa, who are going to have a conversation. So Liana Broder is a lawyer with Mercer, and Melissa Good is an in-house lawyer with Red Cross. And Melissa is commencing, and then Liana speaking, and then Melissa is going to wrap up with a closing frame of how modern slavery applies in their context. So I invite you to the podium. Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks, Sari. So I thought it would be good just to first of all put into context why Australia has passed the Modern Slavery Act. There are more slaves in the world today than there were in the 4 centuries of the transatlantic slave trade, and estimates vary, but the International Labour Organization estimates that there are approximately slavery or slave-like conditions. So everyone in the room has heard about the sweatshops producing garments, cocoa plantations with forced labour. Everything we purchase today potentially has, some forced labour that has gone into producing that. Technology is a typical example. So yes, it is a very significant problem worldwide, but what I think is less understood is that it's also a problem in Australia. Red Cross has run a program supporting trafficked people for the last 10 years. The Australian Federal Police refer people to us who have been subject to some form of modern slavery. And sadly, the number of referrals we get each year is growing. So in the last few years, we've had about 350 people referred to our program, but we think that's actually only a small part of the picture. The Australian Institute of Criminology has very recently conducted a survey and believes that for every victim detected in Australia, there are about 4 victims that go undetected. One of the modern slavery cases in Australia that really surprised me was a person who was in a forced labor situation in a telephone call centre in Queensland. So this person came to Australia on the promise of a great new job, and in fact when he arrived he was taken straight to a house in Brisbane, a big mansion, behind a great big fence, and had his passport taken away and was basically required to work extremely long hours making telemarketing calls. He did manage to escape, flag down a car and get some help, but I found it shocking that in the telemarketing industry, which is an industry that a lot of organisations in this room use, that something like that could happen in Australia. So we're really pleased that there's a Modern Slavery Act that has come into place, and I think Liana is now going to take us through some details of the Act.
Everybody. When I first was asked to be involved in this area, I sort of took a big sigh and I thought, seriously, we're doing slavery in Australian organisations? And I guess I was a little bit naive to think that, I certainly saw, news forecasts about different activities, and I thought there were isolated cases. And when, as Melissa pointed out, it's actually a widespread practice around the world, and most organisations, if not all organisations in Australia, would in some way be touched by modern slavery practices. So the modern, thank you. The Modern Slavery Act is essentially a human rights legislation, and what it does is a little bit unique in that it makes human rights a compliance obligation. And it focuses it on your operations and supply chains. And what the legislation effectively says is that, yes, you can continue doing what you're doing, but not at any cost. There's a line in the sand, and what you need to do is take into account the risk of modern slavery in your operations and supply chains. So what is modern slavery for the purposes of this legislation? It captures 8 categories, which I've listed at the bottom of the slide, which are essentially the offences under the Crimes Code. So it's important to understand that the scope of these laws are actually criminal offences under the law. So what the law is doing is asking you to look for the potential of the risk of criminal offences in your operations and supply chain. And sometimes they might be very close to home, and sometimes they might be very remote from what you're doing. So just to cover very briefly the key points of these laws. The threshold requirements for being caught, there's two tests. There's the entity test, which is very, very broad, captures most organisations within Australia, no matter what form they take, whether they're partnerships, corporations, unincorporated or associations, whether you're exempt from tax or whether you're a tax entity. So most organisations get caught under this test. The second limb of the test is the revenue test, and you need to be a large organisation. So you need to have consolidated revenue of $100 million or more in any financial year. Consolidated revenue is defined by reference to the Australian accounting standards, and essentially it means the revenue of your organisation and the revenue of any organisation that you own or control. If you are caught, you can also voluntarily opt in, I should say, voluntarily opt into these laws by applying to the minister. There are some nuances if you want to then subsequently opt out of compliance. If you are caught, you need to prepare something called a modern slavery statement, which describes certain disclosure obligations on the organisation, and I'll come to that in a minute. The modern slavery statement must be approved by the responsible body and signed by one of the responsible persons. So if you're a corporation, it'll be the board of directors need to approve it and our director needs to sign it. You then need to lodge it with the Department of Home Affairs, who has oversight over these laws, and they will register the statement on a public register. And the purpose of that is to have transparency, and what in practice it will mean is that your statement will be able to be compared with the statement of other entities and will be able to be scrutinised. There is two policy gaps with this legislation. Firstly, there are no penalties for non-compliance. So there are no criminal or civil penalties if you don't comply with the Act. The main deterrent is reputational damages. So some of your stakeholders or somebody in the community might hold your organisation to account if you do not comply. The minister also has powers to compel organisations to comply if they do not do so. The oversight of the regulation is another gap. There is no independent commissioner or body, government body that is overseeing this. It is a government department, the Department of Home Affairs, which also has oversight of the criminal code, which makes these modern slavery activities an offence. And they have a department within they have a unit within the department that has responsibility for this area. There is a Commonwealth legislation as well. It's been passed, it's not enacted, so it's not law. I won't go into it because it actually has gone back to committees for review, and it's not clear whether it's going to proceed because there is already a Commonwealth legislation in place. So just going back to the modern slavery statement, the disclosure obligations will actually dictate what your organisation will need to do to comply. And without going into a lot of detail, the key steps would be to map your supply chains and what your operations are. And that will include any investments you make, any lending activities you do. So it covers the whole spectrum, essentially, of what organisations do. From the very small things, like who do you source your pens from, to very big things where you operate overseas and so forth. You will then need to do a risk assessment on the things that you've mapped out in order to identify the hotspots where the risk of modern slavery practices are in your operations and supply chain. And the concept of risk is quite different to what we typically consider risk when we do risk assessments. So in this context, it's risk to other people. So it's not risk to your organisation. We're not talking about the risk to reputational damage or the risk of financial loss. It's the risk that you have caused or contributed or are somehow directly linked to modern slavery practices through your supply chains or through your operations. Now, once you've mapped that out, you then need to work out what remediation steps you're going to take, and there are guidelines on that. And again, it depends on whether you cause, contribute, or are directly linked to those practices. And then once you do that, you work out your controls to put in place to mitigate those risks. The one challenge in this legislation, which goes further than perhaps laws in other countries, is the obligation to actually test the effectiveness of your risk assessment process and controls. So one point of advice, and I'm just conscious of time, is when you actually work out and try to establish your controls, keep in mind that you'll actually need to report how well you're doing at implementing them and whether they're actually effective.
Okay, Sari tells me I've got 2 minutes. So this is basically, are you able to go to the next slide? I thought it might be useful for the rest of the room to see what it is that a not-for-profit with a not-for-profit budget is going to do in order to implement the requirements of the Modern Slavery Act. So we, first thing we did was create a working group. We had, we've ensured that every part of our organisation is captured in that working group. So we have IT, we have marketing, we have partnerships, HR, everyone sitting on that working group so that everyone is able to feed in and make sure that we're capturing all the risks across our organisation. Above that, we have a steering group with direct reports to the CEO, and they're really just there to make sure that the working group is staying on track. And we've cut this up into 3 different tasks, I guess. So the first part of our project, first stream of our project is the supply chain, which naturally enough is being led by procurement. And essentially that's for everything we purchase, goods or services. And our approach here is to create a supplier code of conduct incorporating modern slavery requirements, which we're going to require all our suppliers to sign, although we will review their codes if they have their own codes. We'll also be including clauses in all our contracts requiring suppliers to comply with the new law, train their staff, make best endeavours to reduce modern slavery risks, and importantly to notify us of any modern slavery risks they become aware of. In parallel with that, we're developing a social responsibility tool, and that was work we were undertaking anyway. And that tool is not only to capture modern slavery risks, but also other human rights risks and environmental risks. So we'll be getting our suppliers to respond to questions in that questionnaire, and the system that we've created will then flag to us whether somebody is a high, medium or low risk supplier, and then we'll work probably with those high risk suppliers to try and improve the modern slavery risks that exist. So then the next part that we're focusing on is operations. So that's really all the other third parties that we're dealing with. So we're looking at our investments to make sure that we're not investing in organisations with high modern slavery risks. Other relationships we have, like with business partners that we collaborate with, we already have a screening process with those partners, and we're just going to make sure that modern slavery is one of the things we screen for as well. What else? So we're then going to draft a standalone modern slavery policy. We think it's important to just have a document that sets out the principles. That also might be something that's useful all the time. Useful when governments, often we have a lot of government contracts, and often they want quite a lot of information from us, and that might be a handy document to set out exactly where our principles lie. I'm going to jump right ahead then to training. We see training as a really important piece of the puzzle, and I guess there are 2 types of training. It's training in regard to the new law, but also we want to do some training so that people recognise indicators of modern slavery. We have a lot of people on the ground. We have 180 Red Cross shops. We're going to make sure that people within those shops are trained so that they recognise indicators of modern slavery. People in shops often chat, often they're retirees who work in our shop and they don't mind to chat with their customers. So we think that might be a good way of being able to find people who are in a vulnerable situation and make sure that they're aware that there are places that they can get help. I better stop.